Okay, greetings everybody. Welcome to Lunar Alchemy, Archetypes, and the Elements. My name is John and I'm here with Bella, again from another special Swedish evening edition of Lunar Alchemy. At this time, we're going to be discussing Gene Key 17 and the archetype of the discoverer. And for those of you who haven't looked at Gene Key 17 recently, you may recall that this is the shadow of opinion moving to the city of omniscience by way of the path of farsightedness. And I'm really excited to explore the nature of this one today, the mythological background, perhaps, if we have time for that, and other aspects of this archetype and the energy that we're looking at here. But before I do, I wanted to share just something that I saw today. This is kind of a joke about the 17 that I think is very, it's like really present for where we are right now. So if you've ever looked at a raven, each raven has 17 primary feathers on their wings, like for flight. And you can see these big feathers on the end of their wings. And these 17 feathers are called pinion feathers. And so when you really are paying attention to this, you'll also notice that crows only have 16 pinion feathers on their wings. So if you're thinking about this clearly, you'll realize that the only difference between a crow and a raven is just a matter of opinion. Ha 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 ha. So that's my corny joke for the day, Bella. Where are you at with your opinions or maybe your prescience of farsightedness? I'm curious to hear your perspective on this one as we begin.
Yeah, so we did speak last week, I think, a little bit about my IQ. So it's 25.6. And in this whole year, or over a year now, we have been following the transits to the wheel. And we know that in the I Ching, it's not gate 1, then gate 2, then gate 3. They come in a different order. So when we have 25, the next gate is 17. And what we also know is that because we are looking at hexagram structure, so when we are in the sixth line of one hexagram, is already overlooking to the next hexagram, and especially then the first line, because that's where it connects. So 25.6 is the last line of the 25, and the next line in the wheel is 17.1. And this is my IQ and my Venus. It's my values, my opinions, if we speak Gene Key language. And I guess I always have something to say. I always think something about things. And I realized that my 25.6 is really already looking at the 17. So it's there. And I don't have 18 or 17, the programming partners in my chart. Yet I do feel like the 17, and especially because my North node is the 62, and that's an harmonic gate, and it has to do with organization. So for me, I absolutely believe that I see things in patterns from that kind of zooming in and zooming out of the 17, and then it connects to my 62, where I can explain it in detail. And then speaking about that same logical circuitry, I also have the 31, that is then the language, where it really kind of comes out maybe in a even more wanting to convince the other, I guess, together in a plan. So yeah, I would start from there. And I think the beautiful thing, yes, one thing there, I think the beautiful thing when you don't have a gate, but you have the 6th line before, is that you're not really attached to it, but you're already, feeling into the energy, and you can kind of use the energy, but it's not like it's there kind of imprinting you. It's more like a curiosity and a way where you're already going, like all the 6 lines, they're already going to the next thing,
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting point because when we look at things like our human design charts, our hologenetic profiles, it's very easy to develop a fixed idea about who and what we are. To say, for instance, Bella, you said your IQ is 25.6. So the idea of the 25.6 being the only thing that you have access to because of that precise moment of your birth. And what you're saying really highlights is the fact that nothing is fixed, everything is moving, and these things like a human design chart or a hologenetic profile are like momentary snapshots of this aspect of time that we can understand our trajectory from. But it never is going to encompass the entirety of the truth, which is why I think it's so beautiful that, in Unlock Your Design, you're exploring these energies through human design and the gene keys and through these other avenues of being able to understand what is possible. And it's, I mean, I'm always amazed at the general harmony that you and I have with our discussions without ever having any pre-discussions of, oh, we're going to talk about this and that. Because you began speaking about what is in your chart and what do you feel from it. And I have the 17, but it's a south node. There's nothing physical there, but it's this energy from which I've come, and on my design side. So this energy is really unconsciously permeating my experience in a very powerful way. And of course, that means that the north node on that side is the 18, the programming partner for me. So I feel very strongly this energy. And Bella, all of the things that you spoke about, your 62 and the 31, are about the manners through which this far-sightedness capability of this archetype or this omniscience that is permeating this archetype can be translated into the world. So I'm happy to see that we're kind of thinking in this similar direction. And since it is my south node, I have to share that I have a really strong opinion about the title of this archetype, the Discoverer. But before we get into that, Bella, I wondered if you might share a little bit about your perspective or your opinions, if you have them, about the energy of this archetype and what does the Discoverer even mean? Like, what are we talking about here? Because when I look at it, the word throws me into a completely different direction than the way that I experience this energy. So I want to hear about your perspective before I share my 17 enriched opinions.
Yeah, I think I might have said that last week, that the archetype 25 was called love, and then I was sitting with it and it came out as the innocent, and it was much more precise. And I might also have shared with you before that all the archetypes from New Year's to the third archetype in Aries, they are since 2020. And
Yeah.
it's just beautiful how we evolve and how
Yeah.
the archetypes come to me now is very different. And before this call, I was sitting with a 17, because often when we're speaking about the gates that are in the lower centers in the body graph, they seem juicy and they seem like they are connected with life force, and they're in the middle pillar and they're tantric and like all these things, that I love to speak about. And now I was like, okay, now we are here connecting the higher part of the body graph, and somehow when we look at the 17 and we have the Ajna, then it tend to be more mental. And I actually don't feel that this archetype is mental. And I know that we don't have that much time for discussions, but we always go over a little bit. So I'm actually going to share, if I can, a little bit of a different perspective, just to see if this is the discoverer or not. So here, this is actually this is one way of portraying the 17. And what we are speaking about here in our discussions are the elements. So on the top we have lake, and on the bottom we have thunder. So this is the trigram for lake, this is the trigram for thunder. We could also say that thunder is the 51, because thunder over thunder is Jinki 51. We could also say that this is Jinki 58, because lake over lake is Jinki 58. So it's combining those two. And we could say that we have thunder that's rumbling under the lake. Like, how much does that sound like a discoverer? No, not very much, you know. On the other hand, you know, if we're speaking about what we were into a little bit last week, the lightning of thunder, and then the lake, we have this lightning in the lake, and that's going to kind of magnetize the whole lake. We know what happens when you put electricity in water, right? So that's what this archetype from an elemental perspective is about. And the word that's been chosen here, and this is Sergio again, Arboleda, who created this. Abaxis is his brand. It's attraction. To attract is the verb that he decided. And when we look at the elements, yeah, I believe so. And there is something where the 17 is really part of bringing in patterns into language, patterns into the world, something that hasn't been named, that hasn't even become, well, even conceptualized, because the language is actually not even coming until we are coming to the throat with the 62. This is even before language, but it's bringing it in, it's attracting it in, and it comes through that lightning through the lake. So this is one way of seeing it. And I mean, I guess that now that you are going to speak about your opinion, I would kind of just ask you to kind of have this idea, and maybe even say something about this idea, this way of portraying it. That would be interesting.
And the numbers and the other word, what is that other word there with the attraction, Tas?
Okay, so this is actually the, how do you say, the pronunciation. And it comes from saying that when we look at thunder, it's where everything begins. It's lightning. It's an electrical spark. So this is like saying it's the first step, and it's also saying it's the first energy of the wheel. So it's the Aries energy, and then two, it's the second. So when we have lake,
second one within Aries.
Yeah, so it's actually it's Aries and Taurus, because then here we have the lake and the form and the vital, you know, and that's feeling and sensing, and that's the Taurus energy. So here we could say that we have a Taurus energy and a Aries energy, or a Venus energy with a Mars energy, and that's also what you can see, like the lovers or the attraction here, with the feminine and the masculine that are coming together.
Thank you. That makes the understanding of what's happening here a lot clearer about how do these elements come together to form this field of attraction. And when I was thinking very deeply about, okay, what element is this about? You know, we talked about thunder and how thunder is really truly a form of the fire element because of the electricity. Thunder, of course, is the sound that is released, but thunder only exists due to the electrical discharge that occurs. But here we have thunder, or as you're saying, I believe very accurately, lightning inside the lake. It's a very unusual circumstance. And so I went searching for some more a way to understand this, and I came across an aspect of Richard Rudd's description that is almost out of place within, it seems almost out of place within Gene Key, the description of Gene Key 17. It's one paragraph within the shadow of the 17, and then it's referenced again during the city description, with just a a brief sentence about it. And this is probably the second or third time that I was reading through the 17 in the recent week. And it suddenly struck me that something was out of place here. What's going on? And Richard was describing how the thunder in the lake impacts us from the standpoint of our 7-year cycles. Bella, you're talking about the IQ. This is the third 7-year cycle of our developmental incarnational process from the perspective of the gene keys, where we develop our mental faculties rapidly. And anything that happens in either of the prior 2 cycles is going to recur and come back through this mental plane. And so when we look at this, if you imagine thunder in the midst of the lake, Richard describes a disruption of the rhythm, the natural rhythm. And these disruptions are what actually results in the forming of opinions. When this is sort of a theoretical idea, because nobody can exist in a vacuum. But if a child were allowed to grow, to learn through play, without any imposition of a synthetic rhythm, meaning you have to wake up and go to school, or you have to do this at this time, or eat now, or sleep now, or whatever it is, they were allowed to simply follow their natural impulses, eating when hungry, sleeping when tired, playing when excited. They would not grow up to be opinionated adults, is basically how Richard puts it. Now, in this context, there's nothing wrong with having opinions. However, opinions can form a fixed energetic around themselves, meaning our mind is searching for a fixed element with which to push away the unease that is underneath the surface of our life, the either underlying anger or deep fear of the uncertainty of life. And when we form an opinion, our mind has created a mental structure that is fixed in nature. The opinion doesn't change. And therefore, once a structure of this nature is formed in our energetic bodies, we then attract to us. I love that this is attraction in what you shared from Sergio. We attract to us the evidence that supports our opinion. So from your description, Bella, this is how I truly believe this field of attraction works through this gene key of the 17. But our only experience of the 17 isn't the shadow. There's something else to it. And when we look at the city of omniscience, we're looking at either the disruption of our internal patterns, meaning this blast of electricity that happens in the lake. And what happens to the water? If you put electricity through water, it's going to do all sorts of crazy stuff, including like bubbling up as if it were boiling, even though it may not be at a temperature to create boiling. Chemically, all of the H2O gets separated into hydrogen and oxygen. This is what ionization of water is. So it creates a field of separation. It's very, very interesting at the very, these small atomic levels. So I'm looking into this and I discover this old Greek myth about this man called Tiresias. And I was like, that name sounds familiar, but I can't remember a thing about him. He was a seer who was described in a variety of other more famous Greek stories like Oedipus Rex. Tiresias is the seer who told Oedipus that he had killed his own father. Oedipus basically leaves when he's a child due to this prophecy, and then he returns home to Thebes, and on the pathway he meets his own father without knowing it, and kills him because they got into an argument on the road. Tiresias is the seer who reveals this truth to Oedipus, who had then went on to marry his own mother unconsciously, unaware of those things. But the story of Tiresias is really interesting. And Belle, I do want to take the time to tell this because I think you'll find this really interesting in terms of this sort of tantric symbology that is underlying all of this. So Tiresias, as a man, a young man, climbed a mountain. And mountains have a lot of spiritual symbolism, meaning when you climb to the top of the mountain, you're closer to the heavens or development. On the mountain, he discovers a pair of snakes copulating. And when snakes do that, they intertwine around each other. And this is the image that we see on the caduceus, the staff with the snakes intertwining. It's also our image of rising kundalini, the snakes going back and forth. Upon meeting these snakes, Tiresias doesn't like what they're doing and strikes one of the snakes, injuring the female. And Hera, who's the Greek goddess, doesn't like Tiresias's attitude and changes him into a woman because he took out his aggression on the female snake. So Tiresias then spends 7 additional years of his life as a woman, experiencing all of the things that a woman experiences, at which point he then encounters the copulating snakes again at this time and leaves them alone, appreciates them for their interplay and their role. And as a result of this, the spell that Hera cast on him was broken and he again becomes a man. So here in this gene key, we have this opinion basis of the shadow where we fix our view on one side of a story, one element of an experience, one limited perspective, in order to make the other perspectives, the other possibilities wrong or less than our own. And this gives us a sense of security. But here's this seer who was eventually gifted with the ability to predict the future, who gets to experience life from both sides as a man and as a woman. And the way that he develops his gift of prophecy is Zeus and Hera have an argument about opinions. Zeus thinks women have the most pleasure in sex, and Hera thinks men have the most pleasure in sex. And having been both, Tiresias answers the question, and I believe there's a great deal of symbolism in this answer that I don't think we'll spend the time to get into. But he says, out of 10 parts, the man has only 1 part of the pleasure of sex, whereas women have 9. And for this, Hera makes him blind, so he's no longer able to see. Zeus, who loves his answer because, of course, he supported Zeus's opinion and made Hera wrong, Zeus grants him the omniscience, the ability to become a predictor and seer of the future. So that's where my opinions led me to discovering. And Belle, I see you smiling at different points of this story, so I want to hear your perspective about it.
Yeah, I really don't know where to go, and I have no opinion on where we go from here, but I can tell you we can go many different ways.
Well, how about you pick anyone that appeals to you, because I would love to hear some of your perspective about all of that, and just about how this particular gene key moves through us, opinions and farsightedness, and what you see going on here from what we've both shared really today.
Yeah, what I see in front of me is the 17 and the 18, and how opaque they are over humanity, over us. And you can see it even more in the division that we have seen, that we're seeing in the world now, but I think it's been accentuated so that we haven't been able to even create our own little bubble in the last 2-3 years. It's been much closer to us. So I believe that the 17 and the 18, the judgment and the opinion are very big in that. And then I'm thinking as well, because we have the 17 connecting the harmonic gate, here is the 62. And when I'm looking at and seeing the geometry of the 61 and the 62, we also have that division. And in both we have kind of the very creative, and then the very logical. Like there is also like the fundamentalism that doesn't have any logic in it, and then the over logic. So I can see a geometry that's created with those two pairs, we could say, and where two of them are harmonic gates, and it's all happening between the ajna and the throat, where the 62 and the 17 connect. And I believe that I can see that there is a lot of focus and concentration there in many human beings, and that is taken from all the other parts. And that's actually what's creating that polarity that we can see in the 61 and the 62. And Richard says in one of them, I think it's in the 62, that the reason for all human disease, for all disease, comes from that disequilibrium between the 61 and the 62. Yeah, that's the geometry that I'm looking at as I'm tapping into what you spoke about.
Yeah, it really makes sense to me with my understanding of this. Another opinion that I have is this gift, farsightedness. It's a weird title. The only time we ever use that phrase in English is when we're referring to our eyesight as being able to see far away but not right in front of us, where there's clarity far away but it's quite blurry up front. And that doesn't describe this gift at all. Although perhaps if you kind of bring in the shadow, maybe the opinion is that muddy sight that's directly in front of us, and that far sight is seeing the greater picture. But what I really glean from this gene keys is the ability to perceive the underlying mechanics, and in a way we could just say, of cause and effect of our reality. What is truly the cause that produces an effect? And oftentimes the way that we perceive, particularly through any shadow frequency of perception, we're actually not seeing the connections, the true connections between cause and effect. We're drawing connections between them in order to satisfy the desires of our ego for survival, for dominance, for any of those shadow qualities. And so when that shadow reaches a higher frequency and becomes this gift, then logic becomes a translator for the underlying mechanics of reality. And just like you were saying, Bella, to translate into language. Richard Rudd mentions the 11, gene key 11, as somebody who can see patterns through archetypes. But with the 17, it's not that way. The 17 doesn't see archetypes. It sees the mathematics, the mechanics that is underlying reality, and is able to use their logic to translate those mechanics so that it makes sense in the world to everybody with an ear to hear, right? So I think it's really interesting to bring in the connection with the 61 and the 62, because there is this very important connection between seeing the mechanics of reality and those who are able to receive that sort of prescient knowledge. In the I Ching, this hexagram is called following, and it speaks very much about leadership and societal roles. And what does it take to be a good leader? It actually plays into what does it take to be a good follower. And I thought that's really interesting in direct relation, Bella, to what you're sharing about the 61 and the 62, and how these aspects of logic and equilibrium are coming together to create something, a new potential together.
Yeah, I also feel that the following is also how, in a mathematical equation, how we're following the equation until you have a solution, like you have a concept that you can trust. So there is also a following through in that sense. And going back to what we were saying before, we are here between the ajna and the throat in a logical, opinionated way where everything can be explained, and it's a pattern that's taking us into the future, because that's the nature of the collective circuitry. And then what we have seen is that the programming partners here, we have the 18 and we have the 61. So the 18 is down in the spleen, and it's sensing, it's intuitive. Like the spleen is all about intuition, and it's actually not afraid of going against authority. So we might have authority, the leading ones that are speaking in the 1762, explaining the pattern or explaining why the pattern has to change and how we're going into the future. But then the 18 can say, you know, I'm not sure I'm sensing this, you know, or there is something important with that intuition in the spleen, and not being afraid of going against the collective in a way. I mean, it is a collective channel, but it's there between the root and the spleen, and it's also not afraid of saying what the last generations of leaders did. We are not ready to follow that anymore. It's like a new spark and fuel from the root that is ready to find vitality and a better way of living. So it's part of the same circuitry, but there is something there that's important when it comes to, I also feel like, the restrictions and the way that we've done things and the rules that we have followed for the last few years. And then we are going up into the 61, and that is the individual circuitry and the inner knowing and the connection with like a higher truth. But it's not a higher truth that comes from anyone who has a way of explaining patterns or explaining the way that we're supposed to do things. So by bringing in that, it really takes us back to ourselves and our inner truth and our connection with source and with God. And of course, we could go and exaggerate that and take it to fundamentalism, like I was a little bit saying before. But really, the true place here in both the 18 and the 61, I feel like it's sensing inside of ourselves what is the right way, what is the right knowing. So I believe absolutely that the 62-17 can be very dangerous because it's very convincing, and then it goes down in the 31-7, and then it can lead us anywhere into any kind of future, and we don't even realize how it went there, because it all made sense. With the 62-17, it always makes sense. So like the shift where you have to go into your intuition, into your body and feel it, and then also to your inner knowing and the connection to the greater, it's so important. And I think that, yeah, this has been the way to lead in the world as well, with logical facts of this sequence of what follows, what comes first and what follows. And that's science, and we tend to believe in science, but we also know that whatever we want to prove, whatever somebody wants to prove, they can prove it.
Yes, there's this in the description of the 17, and I found this kind of unique amongst the gene keys. Many of the descriptions bring up the programming partner, I think almost without exception, in the explanation of the gene key. But for the 17, it's described as almost inseparable from the 18. And to me, it brings together that idea of these snakes coming together and intertwining. And when you talk about if there's leadership who is sharing from the perspective of the 17, how do we know the difference between opinion and farsightedness? However, when you look at the 18 and the gift of integrity, there's no question about whether or not what is being shared from that position is opinionated or it's a vision of the future possibility. And the difference between those two things, an opinion and a true vision of the future, is very, very subtle. But when that 18 is brought in, it becomes extraordinarily clear. And one of the things that, one of the aspects of opinions that is sort of emphasized in that gene key description is being able to see and hold more than one side of an issue at once, to be able to contain the totality of the various opinions. And when that's the case with a leader, if they have that gift, then they understand that they can surround themselves with people who have different opinions from them, where they can learn and receive feedback from people who think differently than they do about what the future is. And in that process can then be informed about the best way to move forward based on the conditions that are present. And I feel like that gets really into how the I Ching describes this particular energy. But one of the things that really, and Belle, I'll give you the last word here in just a minute. One of the things about this myth that really struck me is that when the Kundalini is awakened, it's a journey from the root up to the third eye. Once it reaches the third eye, these serpent energies, it opens it fully, which is the description of this gene key 17. But in the myth, Tiresias on the mountain, these snakes have not completed their process, and he whacks them in the middle of it. This is exactly the same as a childhood trauma. When our inner rhythms are being allowed to come out and be expressed, and then some synthetic rhythm, a harsh traumatic experience interrupts that rhythm, and it's not allowed to be completed, our entire process of development is thrown awry, and we become something that is the opposite of what our inner nature is. Meaning the symbol of Tiresias becoming a woman is probably not very literal. It's more that this energetic production caused him to have the complete feminine experience rather than the masculine experience for which he was built. But what we can recognize from this is that the gift of this shadow of being whacked in the middle of our innocent development, here we come from the innocent, And we come into this gene key 17 and we get whacked in the midst of our innocence. And it changes us into something completely different that we were never intended to be. An opinionated, sort of fixed adult who can't be flexible with the world and can't allow their inner joy and creativity to be fully expressed. It gives us the perspective of the other side. And when we come back to that inner innocence, it allows for this entirely new flowering of awareness that we call omniscience. So, Bella.
Yeah, I do want to say a little bit about this, because I think, again, we are speaking about circuitry and I'm not really pulling up the charts anymore. But if we think about this circuitry, we are in the collective circuitry, and we have spoken about this, the 6217 that goes from the ajna to the throat. Then we did speak about the 31 and the 7 that goes from the throat to the G. And then under that, we have the 515, and that is the natural rhythms. So it's where the Kundalini or the life force is starting, and it's very connected to the Schumann resonance. So like our Kundalini is just a prolongation of the energy that's already there. So for me, it's very accurate to also what you are saying. We can see it in terms of the body graph and how the energy moves in the body and the body graph. And if we cut it there in the 515, like how can it ever come up as a true expression of what we really are in the higher centers? And I also would bring it back to the SQ, where this is the first 7 years of our development, where the first line is rhythm and routine. And it says, in the first line, we know it from the I Ching, is always the foundation. So we can't build if we don't have the first line. So first line is about the rhythm that is so important. And when like I say, when that's whacked, then we try to create often a false security. Which is that opinion or that rigidity. So it's, we can see it and explain it in so many different ways. And I believe that for so many of us, the way back into rhythm, which also goes back to the 25, losing the innocence and constricting, and then starting to breathe again, starting to accept again that we don't have to constrict in order to be safe. That's not the way to go. And the world, the more we constrict and the more rigid we become in our vessels and in our opinions, the more divided the world is going to be. And the more wars and the more sicknesses is what we are going to create, because it's going to, of course, it's a reflection of where we're at and the frequency that we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. I wanted to just look at, I don't know if you have it there, Bella, the gene key 17. Actually, I've got it here. I can bring it up. If I can share my screen. Okay, can you see that, Bella?
Yes, I can.
Okay, beautiful. So I wanted to bring this up because this is the image that you're describing here, Bella, as thunder rumbles beneath the lake. Oracular insight is visible when the waters of the mind are still. So when you're talking about these rhythms, it's like, if you think about the rhythms of the lake, it's the waves. And when we have these disruptions of our natural rhythmic tendency of the waves lapping on the shore, that's where we end up with this crystallization of opinion. And those crystallizations of opinions actually prevent us from being able to move back into that natural rhythm and discovering that essential qualities that Bella was describing the mechanics of. But I just wanted to share that because it's going to relate with our transmission. that we're going to do now to continue with our solar members. If you've been watching us and following us on Facebook, thank you for joining us today for our discussion. If you'd like to explore more deeply lunar alchemy in this process of alchemical transformation that we're engaging with the transmission of quantum energy, you can click on the link that I posted in the comments. We would love to see you in the future as a solar member, and we will be hosting one more special time session next Tuesday for the upcoming transit, so pay attention for that. We won't be having a discussion a week from today. So thank you all for joining us on Facebook. We'll now continue with the transmission portion.